Welcome to the Greenwood. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this is the podcast where we peek under the hood of the most famous outlaw who may have never been. From archers to archaeologists, we interview subject matter experts and content creators to learn why this figure continues to endure and consider what we can learn by examining what historian Maurice Keene called the matter of the Greenwood. When I first started this podcast a few years ago, I made a long list of questions and topics that I wanted to explore. Questions that were inspired by how I was interfacing with the stories of Robin Hood. One of the best aspects of this project, though, has been how many more questions have arisen and how frequently I have been challenged to think about this legendary medieval outlaw from perspectives that I had never considered before. There are many paths into the Greenwood, after all. I'm grateful to previous guest on the podcast, Hilary Rhodes, for connecting me to Dr. Lucy Barnhouse and pointing me to her paper, Disability and Medieval Injustice in the Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, and Robin of Sherwood, 1984. I'm appreciative to Dr. Barnhouse for taking the time to sit down with me for a discussion in which her passion for medieval studies and Robin Hood adaptations really shines through. I know I learned a lot from the discussion, especially about disability studies and the concept of medievalisms. And it reminded me of how there's still a whole lot more for me to learn. I hope that you find our conversation both as enlightening and joyous as I did. So, string your bow, hike a metaphorical deer carcass over your shoulders, and join me in the Greenwood with historian and podcaster, Dr. Lucy Barnhouse. Hello!
Hi!
Nice to meet you. Thank you for joining me.
Very nice to meet you. I was delighted by the invite to talk about, among other things, Robin Hood as disability figure, if you will, and how we can read various Robin Hood adaptations. Because like so many people, I've loved Robin Hood from earliest youth, right? And so looking at how we reimagine these versions of the Middle Ages is a lot of fun. And not unlike Tadeusz Kościuszko, your namesake apparently, which is delightful. Yeah. He's a person that is reconfigured in a number of ways for different audiences, right? So
Yes. Yeah, that's very much one of the points that I wanted to get into with you, that idea of that reconfiguring for different audiences and times. But before we jump into that, let's introduce you to the audience.
Formal introductions, absolutely. I am Dr. Lucy Barnhouse. I work at Arkansas State University, where I've been for the last 5 years. I am a medievalist, specializing in medieval hospitals, which means looking not only at medieval medicine, but also at medieval disability and also at medieval law. And like many medievalists, I also study medievalism, or how the Middle Ages are received and reinterpreted and reimagined in pop culture, which is what brought me to Robin Hood, or brought me back to Robin Hood. I spent many years of my childhood imaginatively in the Greenwood, so I'm delighted to be back there as well. But coming back to Robin Hood to think through Robin Hood and disability studies was a fairly recent project.
Yeah, so we've hit before on the topic of medievalisms in the podcast, but it's not a concept that I think is really out there in the ether in general for the public consciousness.
Okay, so I can do the short version of that. Medievalism is something for which Walter Scott, I think, is largely responsible, not single-handed.
He's
But if I were
responsible for a
to
lot, that guy.
he is, though. He is. Um, so if I were to teach a class on medievalism in the English-speaking world, I would call it From Walter Scott to Ridley Scott, and
Ooh, that's
we would cover
catchy,
everything.
catchy. Yeah.
Thank you. Everything in between. And so we find medievalism in novels like the Cadfael Mysteries, of which I am a big fan, in video games galore of a wide variety, as I learned from my students. Yeah. In Game of Thrones, famously or infamously or notoriously, depending on your attitude, perhaps, and in many different ways in Ridley Scott films, which could be a topic all their own. Umberto Eco, who wrote The Name of the Rose, which your listeners may be familiar with as the Sean Connery movie or the more recent TV series or as the really great and hilarious book, theorized medievalism, talking about different versions of the medieval that appear in pop culture. And one of these is the pretextual Middle Ages. And I think that matters here because in many Robin Hood media, particularly, the medieval gets sort of slapped in as a background and then only sort of alluded to. It's medieval times out there. Almost
Hmm.
anything could be happening.
Yeah.
But the idea of what medieval Europe was like and what kinds of possibilities existed there is what medievalism is about. Even though Robin Hood is not in the delightful Heath Ledger movie, A Knight's Tale, I think that might be a useful example for your readers, because I think that's a tremendously clever movie in how it uses medieval material culture in some
Hmm.
ways, is deliberately anachronistic in other ways, and of course has Queen and Bowie on the soundtrack, which improves anything. And as I always tell my students, Queen and Bowie are anachronistic to the Middle Ages the same way an Erich Wolfgang Korngold orchestral soundtrack is to the Middle Ages in 1938 for Errol Flynn. But because of Erich Wolfgang Korngold, whose work for Hollywood I adore, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That is what the Middle Ages sounds like in my students' minds, sort of loosely.
Hmm.
Not a hurdy-gurdy, but full Hollywood orchestra. But the full Hollywood orchestra and We Will Rock You, neither existed in the Middle Ages. Tragically, I'm convinced that 14th century peasants would have been really into it, but
How could they not?
yeah, how could they not? Truly. Truly. So that's what medievalism is, basically. It's what pop culture makes of the medieval,
Hmm.
in air quotes, which I realize that your podcast audience can't see.
Right. And that so much informs just the general perceptions that we have of the Middle Ages. You know,
Every single conversation I have with someone who asks what I do for a living. Yep.
right. It creates, these ideas that you get in something like the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves film, where we have these pre-Christian Celts and Druids, but also we have witches and things. We have knights on horseback. It's just like everything that seems vaguely medieval can just get thrown into a pot and mixed around, and it just reads as, oh, that's the Middle Ages to an average moviegoer.
Well, and you see, that is something that fascinates me because to me, I look at Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and I say this with great affection. And we have the Ku Klux Klan being there, essentially. We have the Swiss Family Robinson being there, essentially. Love a good forest treehouse.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
I grew
we
up with the
have,
Yorks, yeah.
as you say, we have some Picts, 1,000 years too late, but who is counting?
Yeah, just
And of course,
1,000.
we have Alan Rickman in black leather, for which everyone is very grateful. But as Dr. Rachel Clark has argued, all of this, which makes absolutely no sense, actually reads successfully to most people, as you say, as the medieval. She calls this Robin Hood times because Robin Hood media, I think, are often kind of special in terms of medievalism because, on the one hand, there's a very high degree of specificity. We are told it is 1192.
Yeah.
Exactly. Possibly March, right?
Right.
But what is happening in 1191 to 3-ish, right? King Richard
Yeah.
off fighting the Crusades, imprisoned possibly, right? That is just Robin Hood times. Whatever the filmmakers decide is their vision of 1192. It could include the draft, as in the Otto Bathurst movie of 2018. There
Hmm.
are all sorts of things that can happen in Robin Hood times.
Yes. Yes. Anything that can read as medieval can be there. One of the things that I highlighted in your paper, just the like opening phrase of your paper, disability and medieval injustice in the adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, and Robin of Sherwood, 1984, was the phrase, the society in which Robin Hood operates on the large and small screen is typically a dysfunctional one. So I think that is kind of what separates the Robin Hood times as a particular type of medievalism. There has to be that reason for Robin Hood to exist.
Right, exactly. Of course, dysfunctional fake medieval societies are legion, but for Robin Hood, it really has to be. He often gets caught up in what I might call Schrodinger's Middle Ages, that it's, simultaneously dysfunctional and horrible, but potentially also a place of jolly good fellowship and camaraderie.
And everything will be fine when Richard comes back.
Contextually, well, and that kind of fundamental conservatism of arguing that Richard needs to come back to restore order is, I think, something that different Robin Hood adaptations respond very differently to. And
Yes.
I am fascinated, yeah, by reading the variations on that idea and the subversions of that idea. I'm sure we could have a whole conversation just working through the Robin Hood filmography of the last 100 years and saying, all right, what is King Richard doing in these films?
Oh,
But
we
that's
are
not our topic for today.
we are doing that on the podcast. We are watching every single Robin Hood film from the past 100 years, and well, yeah, all of them, including non-American ones, and non-British ones, and there's a lot. And one of the things that invariably gets discussed is that role of King Richard, how he relates to what's going on, how much Robin Hood is truly serving as a hero to the people versus serving as the the Praetorian Guard for Richard, you know. Because you get things like going all the way back to the Douglas Fairbanks film where he like state like the mission statement he has as Robin Hood, as we're holding Robin Hood, or we're holding England for King Richard. Like it is so much not, we're like they're working against Prince John because he's being a baddie, but it's for Richard. It's like front and center. They have his coat of arms displayed in their hideout. It's
Oh,
really,
yeah, no, I've seen the movie. Yeah.
yeah, it's really blatant. And like nothing is that blatant, but it's still a lot of variations of that. I'm very excited because the next thing we're covering is the King's Fool episode of Robin of Sherwood.
Oh, John Rhys Davies. I love John Rhys Davies. And I think not only is the question of how a Robin Hood adaptation handles Richard interesting, but I personally have a metric in my heart for how much of a Plantagenet disaster Richard is. And I think that John Rhys Davies having a man kiss his hand with the mouth he's just bloodied is perfect Plantagenet disastering. That gets an A+ rating for me. I will look forward to listening to that episode in the fullness of time. I would argue that both the Errol Flynn film and the Robin of Sherwood adaptation do not place Robin as a surrogate or placeholder, or vice regent,
Yeah.
literally, for the king, but rather suggest something interesting about how Robin's true mission is achieved outside the
Hmm.
traditional hierarchies of English society. Arguably, Robin of Sherwood goes further with this
Yes.
in, I think, the 2 episode set that follows Richard's return, or am I
I think
misremembering it?
there's just one with Richard
Okay,
and Robin
there's
of
a lot
Sherwood.
that gets in there.
Yeah.
But, Robin himself in the 1938 film is asked by the disguised King Richard if he would, critique the king's policies. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll critique absolutely anything that keeps the king from doing his job, which he is not doing, did I mention?
You
King
would
Richard,
condemn a Holy Crusade? Yes,
yes,
yes, I would.
I'd condemn anything. Yes, exactly. Clearly, we both have this movie memorized because we are people of taste.
Deep.
Yeah,
It is deep in here.
yeah, absolutely. Formative. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that is interesting going from that Douglas Fairbanks to the Errol Flynn, and then almost seeing that little bit of a backslide in the decades that follow, and then seeing, Robin of Sherwood that's really going to question things, because not only are we going to say, like, oh, maybe Robin's not just there to be a puppet of the king, but maybe the king is also not so good himself and not going to stand up for people after he's come back. And then, like, the next time we see Richard, it's Sean Connery, and he's being just oh so noble and gallant, really like flying in the face even of Sean Connery's own Robin Hood film.
Well, I was just going to say, because Robin and Marion, right, is this great Vietnam War era Robin Hood with Richard Harris as, a king who is delusional and diseased. That is a fever dream of a movie, and I love it. One of the questions I asked myself, though, in looking at the Errol Flynn film, was about its specific context in the 30s. Because one of the things that I found really interesting was that, as you say, this vision of who Robin Hood is and what he does and who he does it for is, I would argue, much more subversive, much more genuinely egalitarian
Mm-hmm.
than anything we would get in the 50s.
Right.
And really much more subversive than much quote unquote medieval media is in these, should we say, you know, first decades of Hollywood, right? I know obviously Douglas Fairbanks is by no means the first Robin Hood movie, but from like 1908, 1912, 1922, then 1938 subversive Robin Hood is what I would argue. And then we go back to the 50s with just, good guys, bad guys. And there's much to be said about Robin Hood as filmed in an era of McCarthyism and working against that. But fundamentally, I do think that 1938 is doing really interesting things in an era when eugenics
Mm-hmm.
was socially centered.
Yeah.
And it foregrounds the ethnic misalliance of Robin and Marion in really interesting ways. And of course, we watched this movie. Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland are two very gorgeous white people. But the fact that the film never allows us to forget either how gorgeous they are, obviously, or that they come from different backgrounds, right,
Mm-hmm.
ethnically, means that they really are flirting with a violation of the Hays Code, right? They get away with it, I think, because they're both white. But he's
Yeah.
Saxon and she's Norman. And the Normans are also very explicitly concerned about this. They've offered her the perfectly acceptable Norman able-bodied suitor, Guy of Gisborne, Basil Rathbone,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
snarling superbly as he always does, whom she sort of tentatively accepts, as the king's ward before
Right.
entering on her magnificent arc of joining Sherwood Society and aligning with Sherwood Society.
Right. Whereas the Saxons are called dogs and treated as subhuman by the
Mm-hmm.
Normans.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's many things that are great. Subtle is not one of them.
Yeah, yeah. The jokes about hanging a Saxon from every tree. Oh, not too many, or we'll have nobody to till the land and pay the tax. Just utterly dehumanizing of a massive group of people.
Yes. And the ways in which this is also explicitly linked to disability and to disabling violence are
Hmm.
textually explicit, but have not been investigated that much. And that was something that I wanted to dig into, to say, I think it's meaningful that Robin Hood is not a surrogate for dehumanized and disabled individuals and groups any more than he is a surrogate or stand-in for Richard. But what he does, I argue, is make it possible for men and women of multiple ethnicities and multiple abilities to join his band. The great
Mm-hmm.
heroic scene, which has become a trope of Robin Hood media because of Errol Flynn, where he's giving his liberating message to the men of Sherwood, is one that explicitly visually highlights people who have received disabling legal punishments at Norman
Right.
hands, right? He says the beatings, the maimings, the blinding with hot irons. And it's these people who are joining his cause, who are invited to join his cause, who are invited to join his fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so before we jump too much more into that, one of the things that you've mentioned that you specialize in, just to kind of also help the listeners get on the same page, is this idea of disability theory, especially as it relates to the Middle Ages. So, what is disability theory, and how does it relate to historical study?
Well, I'm not sure that I would speak of a single theory of disability, but disability studies is a
Okay.
very active and vital academic subfield that examines disability in historical contexts. So, while in the Middle Ages, for instance, we do not see a communal sense of identity for all those with disabilities, the way we might now, right? In
Mhm.
the era of the ADA and the protests by disability activists that made that possible in the 90s, there has been for very
Shockingly recent, really.
blink of an eye from a medievalist perspective. In that perspective, there are alliances among, those with mobility impairments and those with sensory impairments. And I'll get to the impairment disability discussion in a second. Whereas in the Middle Ages, where you often might see people with mobility impairments and sensory impairments in saints' lives or in pictures of people interacting with hospitals, there's not necessarily a sense of shared identity that we see among people with different kinds of disability. And part of the reason that I ventured to be slightly difficult and say, well, I'm not sure there's one disability theory, is that one of the things that scholars of disability do is look at different models of understanding
Hmm.
disability.
Hmm.
And this is true even among medievalists. So I'm realizing that for a person who doesn't think about this every day, they might say, well, how many people can there be who study medieval disability, right? And is there enough there for them to disagree? And the answer is, oh, well, there are more of us than you might think. And yes, we do sometimes disagree with each other. Plus, we may need or want to use different models of understanding historical disability in different contexts. So we can look at a religious model of disability that might inform how disability appears in a saint's life. So, for instance, in a saint's life, the narrative expects that a blind person will become sighted again,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
That a person who is temporarily or chronically insane, the term often used in the medieval sources means literally out of their mind, right? Out of their senses, that they will be restored to their senses. Now, from a disability study,
Restoration through faith and miracles.
what, sorry?
Restoration through faith and miracles is being how.
Well, and the idea of a disability or impairment as something that needs, quote unquote, what you call restoration or healing is, of course, extremely problematic.
Yeah.
But I would argue that that's not something we see necessarily as a normative or dominant cultural view in the Middle Ages. Now, there may be competing and coexisting views. There's a really great recent memoir by a disability activist. The book is titled My Body is Not a Prayer Request. And the author is Amy Kenny. So thinking about religious models of disability and persons with disabilities is obviously something that is still with us. I use the language of disability and impairment because the way I discuss it with my students is an impairment is something absolute that isn't changed, right? So a degree to which you are hard of hearing or might have imperfect sight or might be missing a couple of fingers or a limb, that's an impairment. And a disability describes, I would argue, how that impairment affects your relationship with society. And the extent to which a certain condition, if just to cover all manner of things, or impairment may be disabling, depends a lot on social and individual choices.
Right.
As your listeners are not able to see, I wear glasses. My eyesight,
as do I. Yeah.
yes, my eyesight issues would be much more disabling if I did not wear glasses. In society today, glasses as an aid, right, are not stigmatized in the way that canes, for instance, sometimes are. So I've worn glasses since my mid-20s. I've never gotten weird looks about it. My friends of a similar age who use mobility aids could not say the same thing. Right? I have two fingers that don't quite bend correctly, so there's a mild impairment there, legacy of a weird accident several years ago. But on a day-to-day basis, that's not disabling for me, even though it is technically an impairment. So I'm using these personal examples just to sort of illustrate.
And it's not stigmatizing either.
Exactly, that too. That too. So the question of how we think about and think through, right, what disability means is also, right, a part of disability studies. And along with many others, though not all scholars of medieval disability, I would argue that the default in the Middle Ages is what we might call a model of semi-integration, where care in the community, to use a phrase of the mid-20th century, is sort of the norm. And where we don't see the strong idea of a quote-unquote ideal body or an ideal body mind, to get a little more jargony, that we see being formed more strongly in the early modern period.
Okay. So when we say communities of care, we're talking about like family and neighbors just living with people who have various conditions and it not being stigmatized, but just treated as, if their condition impairs them in some way, then a family member helps them or a neighbor helps mend their fence or whatever, does whatever is the thing that needs to be done to help care for them and work over the impairment, but they're otherwise not excluded.
But I think would depend to a large degree on what the impairment is and how it is understood. Generally, I would say yes. Some of my hesitation here, Thaddeus, if I may, is because you use the term condition, and one of the things my students are often really curious about are medieval responses to what we would term neurodiversity.
Okay.
And I believe that there are a lot of examples of what we would identify as potentially disabling conditions that medieval people would not necessarily categorize as being any kind of impairment at all. It would just be a manifestation of human difference. Now, what we might term obsessive behavior or compulsive behavior, that could be termed the result of demonic possession, right? Potentially. But that also, I think, very interestingly, would not blame the person affected or their family, right? It externalizes the condition where we might say, oh, well, that's a chemical imbalance and there are pills for that. A medieval person might say, oh, alas, John is afflicted by a demon. We shall light a candle for him to St. Anthony, right? Who was also tempted by demons, as we know, through no fault of his, right? So
Right.
there are many options. In Robin of Sherwood, as many of your listeners may know, one of the main characters, Much, right? Clearly has a brain that does not work the way the other characters' brains do, right? And the men of Sherwood and Marion are often reminding Much of how the world works, what they can expect from a social interaction, that he should ride a horse instead of running for a journey of many miles, that he should pick up the pot off the fire using, a fold of cloth so he doesn't burn himself. But I would argue Much is also never infantilized. He's a fighter within the band. He
Yeah.
is Robin's younger brother, so Robin is fiercely protective of him as a younger brother. But Much is also a full participant in the band, and the people who stigmatize him in the story are the sheriff, Buhis, and his allies.
Right. Yes. Yeah, and that is one of the things that I really noticed and appreciated about that show is that there are times where it is clear that his presence could even be potentially damaging to the rest of the people. Like he is slower to act. Has a lot of hesitancy, but there's no hesitation on their part to make sure that he is still included and he is never berated in any way. He's still, the next time they go out, he's still with them. He's still included.
And part of why I read Robin of Sherwood through this disability studies lens is that model is one that says the most important thing, the most valuable thing in our community is interdependence. It is a fundamental reality of humanness that we all depend on each other and interact in a range of ways. And so the ethos of saying we all belong together and that's how it is, without the qualifier of sort of saying, well, even though Much might endanger us. Like there's none of that, I would argue, in the
No,
show.
they don't say it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's never raised as an issue, never appears to be felt. And we know for a fact, I think it's fair to say, that when something bothers Will, he will make an issue of it. Like, so it's not something that would be passed over in silence. Will can and will complain about anything that bothers him. And I think that's also a really interesting aspect of the Cross of St. Syracuse episode, because while it's wrong about medieval leprosy, it does represent Will as much more afraid of becoming leprous, right?
Oh, yes.
And of acquiring a potentially disabling and, in the world of the show, more than in medieval Europe, stigmatized disease than Much is.
Yeah, very true. So just since we hit on that topic of leprosy, because that's one of those things that is just so often portrayed in medievalisms, or in medieval films and the like. It shows up in things that we've mentioned already, like Cadfael, like Prince of Thieves, like Robin of Sherwood, and that is so much colored my perceptions of like, oh yeah, lepers, they're the people that live in colonies and dressed in rags all the time from head to foot. Tell us a little bit more about how we're all wrong in what we think.
Anybody's favorite subject. Well, okay, so For one thing, the idea of a quote unquote leper colony is very modern. It's Victorian, essentially. Carol Rockcliffe, about 20 years ago, literally wrote the book on that. And she writes about how the 19th century has shaped our idea of what medieval leprosy was in interesting ways. The Middle Ages, and I'm talking about medieval Europe here chiefly, though we certainly could talk about the global medieval world and the disease, which I'm calling leprosy for reasons I'm getting to in a moment, they don't have isolation hospitals in the way that isolation hospitals, asylums, colonies come into being in the early modern and modern period. Now, I want to clarify that I'm using the term leprosy and the term the leprous for people with leprosy in the Middle Ages because we don't know that everyone with quote unquote leprosy in medieval Europe had Hansen's disease. With the identification of the bacterium that causes Hansen's disease in 1877, it became possible to identify the disease identity and the branches of disease that we would diagnose, right, using bacteria as Hansen's disease. And because leprosy is a stigmatized term, because of, as you say, the often oppressive institutional history of colonies and asylums that were very marginalizing, that's not a term we would use for the disease or those with it today.
Mm-hmm.
But as a historian of medicine and disease, I think, well, it's kind of anachronistic to say Hansen's disease, not because medieval diagnostic tools were always inefficient, but because the way that this disease was culturally constructed and understood for them has nothing to do with the mycobacterium and has nothing to do with Hansen, the guy who was working in the 19th century, but for them, right, the disease identity, lepra in Latin, right, is the thing that they find in the Gospels, right, where, you know, Christ heals the 10 leprous men. And I'm using the term leprous also rather than lepers because of the stigma associated with someone like, you know, being a leper and that being their whole identity, right?
Right.
So this may be far more technical language than your listeners want to discuss a TV episode from the 80s. But you're absolutely right that the shorthand, the visual shorthand of having medieval Europe be a place where disease is not understood and where those with contagious disease are stigmatized and marginalized, right? Discriminated against, and where, you know, disease is scary, right? And something that people are really deeply irrational about, right?
Yeah.
All of these things tie into what we think, well, not me, but, you know, what we quote unquote think we know about what medieval Europe was like. Unscientific, unhygienic, ignorant, and superstitious, probably.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Very superstitious.
Right. So the image of, you know, the person with leprosy in the Middle Ages going around going, unclean, unclean, which I think they literally do in the Cross of St. Syracuse episode, is one that we find in Robert Louis Stevenson of Treasure Island fame. He wrote this unhinged kids novel that's set during the Wars of the Roses. And I say this with great affection. I love it. It's called The Black Arrow. Recommend it. Full of inaccurate ideas about what the Middle Ages were like. But it recurs again and again. As you say, it's in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. It's in Robin and Marian briefly, I believe. And it's certainly in Robin of Sherwood. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the reality is, I would say, people with leprosy in the Middle Ages are cared for often, but not always, in hospitals. And to that extent, I would say Cadfael is absolutely right. The hospital for leprous people is a little bit outside the town. They weren't always, but they were often just a little bit outside the town to avoid contagion. And they were often managed by monasteries. And as we see in Cadfael, like Brother Mark, Cadfael, the young episode of the week protagonist played by Jonathan Firth, right, are all fine with interacting with the leprous because they're decent people, right? But they are also sort of audience stand-ins who are the exceptions to the medieval rule of shunning the leprous and being mean to them. Although Tara Fitzgerald, radiantly beautiful as the other half of that episode's protagonist pairing, gives them alms, right? But yes, medieval leprosy, neither as stigmatized nor as sequestered as is generally imagined.
So, on that topic of what is generally imagined and how superstitious and ignorant everyone was back then, the other phrase or combination of phrases that I hear constantly, sometimes from scholars, is, or at least from people who are keenly involved in studying the Middle Ages, whether it's for writing fiction or other things, is how the Middle Ages were a nasty, brutish time. And that word brutal or brutish and violent are words that I hear constantly, especially in relation to Robin Hood stories, but also just in general. And it really, one of the things that struck me reading that one paper you wrote about the disability and medieval injustices in these adaptations is how, well, society or the power structures in society need to be violent and brutish to create the conditions for which Robin Hood needs to exist. But it's very important to remember that this is where the medievalism comes in and that these are modern adaptations, not reflections of medieval reality.
Right. Your listeners have been spared my face journeys during your preceding description of cliches about the medieval. They are so widespread that I teach with a textbook by my friend Winston Black that takes a bunch of these cliches and debunks them chapter by chapter, right? The Middle Ages were superstitious. No. People were dirty and never took baths. No. The church, frowned on science. No. Right? Like, just cliche after cliche, but these have formed our ideas of what the Middle Ages are. The 19th century truly has a lot to answer for. And I would say very simply, no. I don't know what other scholars you've spoken to, and this might be a situation where I would fight with these colleagues or historical authors, more or less amicably over a cup of tea or a pint. But I would say that it does everyone involved a disservice to imagine the Middle Ages as inherently more violent or more brutal than our present reality.
Yes.
I've talked to a lot of people in the last few months, especially about how they're watching or listening to or reading less news than usual because it disturbs them so much. So I think it would be really hypocritical of us to say that the medieval period is more violent than the modern. A short version of why I think this is that in the 19th century, when the discipline of history as a professional discipline was taking shape in Europe and the US, and medieval studies as a thing, right, as a field of academic study was taking shape, this was the height of European nationalism and imperialism. And Europe needed to have transcended its own dark, barbarous, violent medieval past, right?
Yep.
In order to become truly modern, to become scientific, enlightened, inclusive, don't talk about the other bits, and thus spread civilization to everyone else on Earth.
To justify being the ones that are bringing righteousness around the world.
Yes.
Righteousness and quote and unquote civilization.
Right. I'm sure your listeners can hear our air quotes and sarcasm at this point, yes. So I think the medieval becomes modernity's opposite in this discourse, and for better and for worse, it becomes different, right? It's childish, whereas we are mature. It is religious, whereas we are secular. It is anti-science, whereas we are pro-science. It is violent. We are civilized, right? So there are all these dichotomies. And we see this, I think, even in positive medievalisms, whether that's William Morris in the arts and crafts movement in the late Victorian period saying, you know what, the Industrial Revolution kind of sucks for a lot of people. And actually, the idea of being connected to your communities and having beautiful things made on purpose rather than having depressing uniform factory goods in overcrowded cities is nice, actually. Or the modern version of that is like a Forbes or Business Insider article that keeps going around saying, you work at your 9 to 5 more than a medieval peasant worked. And like there's a lot to unpack there. But
Yeah.
one of the premise is that, you should be shocked and appalled that you're working even more than a medieval peasant. Clearly the audience for that article is not doing a lot of gardening, for one thing, I think, because have you guys tried to keep vegetables alive? I
Right.
have.
Not a
Let
lot
me
of,
tell
probably
you
not a
things.
lot of animal husbandry that they're doing.
Right, right. But I think these are an underlying set of assumptions that go into medievalism, especially perhaps what Rachel Clark calls Robin Hood times.
Yes. And Robin Hood fans will really appreciate her article, Azim and the Witch. That's a very fun read as well. Yeah. I think it is really incumbent upon us to not think of ourselves as so special. And there's no particular reason to think that humans are less violence prone now than they have been throughout the course of our history. It may have looked different ways. We may have had different laws relating to legal punishments, but we're not living in a time where we have extinguished war. We're not living in a time where we have extinguished football hooliganism or police brutality. People get trampled on Black Friday sales.
It's
There's
true.
violence in our modern day, and there's no reason to think that because people lived in the past, they were somehow more violent than we are now.
Right. And they don't have Black Friday sales or standing police forces or giant football matches. But we do see violence coming out in other ways. I'm not trying to paint it as a golden age,
Oh, yeah.
but one of the reasons I am really interested by both of these adaptations, not just because both of them are a rollicking good time, but both of them, I think, treat the Middle Ages with a real sympathy and a real respect as being a time period where people were capable of critical thinking and where we see a lot of diversity within that medieval society. That is diversity of opinion, right?
Hmm.
At the very least, uh, in ways
Yeah.
that I think are still comparatively rare in medieval media, which is to say nothing of all the hilarious medieval law jokes in Robin of Sherwood, which make it very close to my heart.
Can you give me an example of the law in Robin of Sherwood that they're playing with?
Yeah, so one of my favorite moments is where the sheriff and Guy of Gisborne are debating the action of a thief, I think. And Gisborne goes, do we hang him? And you can see a part of the sheriff's soul die in his eyes. Nicholas Grace is so great. He goes, no, Gisborne. And you can also almost see him suppressing the lecture about that's high justice and this is a middle justice crime, and also the introduction of the abbot's character, played by Philip Jackson of Inspector Japp fame, is where he's storming into the great hall where the sheriff is sitting doing sheriff things. And he says, by Christ, Robert, I will not lose my fish pond.
Yeah.
I the first time I watched that is I had to pause and just howl with laughter because I never see fish pond drama in medieval TV. Whereas when I'm sitting in the archives looking at many, many, many business records compiled by medieval hospitals, like it's all about the fish pond drama and the roof drama and the wheat field drama, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah. Those
kind
land
of,
rights.
yeah,
Yeah.
but that kind of thing, I think, is really a lot of fun.
Hmm.
I am
Yes,
a niche
it is. And
audience. I
it's one of the things I really appreciated about that show it was a way of bringing in a lot of these villainous figures who are coming from positions of power, but had a variety of different motivations. So you have, like, in the opening two-parter to the show, a literal evil sorcerer who's worshiping a demon, but then you also have this greedy abbot who's like, I'm not going to lose my fish pond. I want these lands.
Yes.
The fighting over what happens with Marion. Actually, one of the things I like about that show is that the fights about Marion are about the wealth and privileges that she brings. It's not as gross as other adaptations.
Well, there's a whole discussion to be had there
Yeah.
about Maid Marian as a figure within the narratives. But I agree. The friend who first recommended this show to me, the late Dr. Damon Douglas Hickey, said to me, "Oh, you have to watch Robin of Sherwood. There's a lot of misty pagan sorcery, and it's the most historically accurate Robin Hood show you'll ever see." And I said, "Damon, you are pulling my leg. You can't have
Right.
misty stag god sorcerers and have it be the most historically accurate Robin Hood show you'll ever see."
Yes.
And then I watched it and I had to eat humble pie. I had to say, "I'm so sorry. You were right and I was wrong." Right? It's
It's
all there.
yeah. That's fully been my read as well. Like,
Yeah.
it has these elements that are entirely fantastical. They really what bring a lot of these fantastical elements into the ethos with Robin Hood isms and Robin Hood times. But in terms of the actual portrayal of people and how they're living and their interactions with one another, and that's one of the key points that I've always had about the show, is how much the interactions with the people, especially the main cast, is what makes it feel real. And it's very inclusive. As we mentioned before, there's we talked about much, but also like Friar Tuck. There's one episode where they're trying to run away from the sheriff's men, and Tuck is slowing them down because he's a large guy and he can't run as fast. So they help him hide up a tree and then keep running. And again, there's no shaming him. There's no notion that he doesn't belong. He's absolutely somebody who they make sure gets rescued at the end. There's no like, well, we got to leave that guy behind. They're people who just genuinely are going to be caring for one another and look out for one another because they see them all as sort of extensions of themselves, and they're just all part of that same community.
Well, I think that the communal ethos of the show and the ethos of the Sherwood community in that show is something that I read as very compatible with the values of disability activism. Because then again, I would argue that that episode, the series 2 finale, which broke my heart, still not over it. I would argue, I would argue that they don't frame it as quote unquote Tuck slowing them down, but they have different levels of ability in terms of running fast, just as they have different levels of ability in strategizing.
That's
And
a better way of putting it. Thank you. Yes.
and so they accommodate Tuck's need for escape, which looks different from everyone else's need for escape. Like, what is the safest option for Tuck? What is the safest option for Marion? What is the safest option for Mutt? Often because of race, what is the safest option for Nazir to take in this situation may be different from, what is the safest option for Will or John to do in this situation. And I think that readiness to recognize and work with difference without treating it as necessarily a departure from the norm, saying, well, much is slowing us down, or much, or made a bad decision, or well, Tuck is slowing us down, but rather just saying, we are all in this together and we will work together to meet everyone's needs and move forward as best we can, is something that I find really beautiful and that lines up with the ethos of a lot of disability activists and with a lot of disability studies people's theorizations of, right, what inclusive community can look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's very well put. Thank you. I want to be respectful of your time, and I'm really appreciative of this conversation. While we're on that sort of topic about these communities, one of the other things I was hoping I could get you to touch on is something that you bring up in that one paper we've mentioned relating to Robin Hood being the sort of one whose physical body is on the line
Mm-hmm.
as a sort of like avatar of
Mm-hmm.
ableness.
Well, okay. I would argue that he's not a figure representing normative ability or the normative abled body. I would argue that that's not what he's doing. And to get into this part of my argument is why, in conversations with friends for a long time, I would just say, oh, this is the project that is going to require me to show other scholars Errol Flynn's thighs for science. Look, we are speaking, Thaddeus, to an audience of Robin Hood people. Just in case you've never seen The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, take a moment here to Google Errol Flynn, Robin Hood. Come back after you've done that, maybe had a cold glass of water in the aftermath. And I think it matters. And I mean this with 100% academic, serious sincerity. I think it matters that Errol Flynn is the most beautiful man you have ever seen. I think it matters that he transcends the norm of physical ability, that this is a version of able-bodied masculinity that
Hmm.
is so secure that it
Right.
does not need exclusions to reinforce it. It is not threatened by anything. You cannot threaten that, right?
Yes, and I think that
Um,
is very important with that presentation. He gets bested in the quarterstaff duel by Little John and laughs it off.
Yes. Oh, I love that scene so much. I love everything about that scene so very much. Little John, Will Scarlet, Robin Hood, and Mudge. Although I don't think he's in that scene. All of these are very different versions of masculinity. Friar Tuck also, and everyone is having a great time. Um,
Hmm.
I love that movie. A perfect movie in my heart. And while I would argue that Robin of Sherwood is doing somewhat different things with gender and the performance of masculinity, I would argue that similarly, Michael Praed's Robin Hood, in a number of ways, is not conforming to norms. He is not saying, well, not all of us can conform to the norm, but I can. He is saying, I think we all should just reject these norms altogether, actually, because I think they're a bit shit. And we are going to instead embrace the freedom of the Greenwood,
Right.
um, and live out here together, despite the fact that we are now proscribed and that he is legally condemned, so that anyone can shoot him on sight. But
Yes, I read it as kind of a rejection of that dysfunctional society and this like
absolutely.
we have to make our own society now.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that both, not to dunk too much on Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, but I think that both of these versions say not only will we have an alternate society, but we have alternate principles. It's not just that we are temporarily in Sherwood in our own society, but we reject the norms and principles that create your society, with its toxic masculinity, with its disabling violence, with its ableism, with its
Hmm.
sexism. We reject all of that. Racism, eugenics, eugenicist logic, we are rejecting all of that, and we are going to be over here in Sherwood doing something very different.
Yes. Something that is, oh, I think there was something else I wanted to highlight at the very end of
By all
that
means.
article, just where you mentioned exactly that idea of let's see, I think I highlighted it, but then I had to re-download the paper. Yeah, here we go. They use the Middle Ages to critique recognizable injustices and to showcase collective resistance to injustice as not only necessary, but joyous. And I wanted to highlight that joyous element and give you the opportunity to say why you thought that part was worth mentioning as well, why the joyous matters, not just the rejection of the ableist and cruel society.
I'm delighted to speak on that. It is here where your listeners will learn explicitly, if they didn't know already, that I think I can trace many of my deepest political and moral convictions to being really obsessed with Robin Hood when I was 6 and 7 years old. I was convinced that he was the coolest person in the world, and I still am. And I think that in a historical and cultural moment where I think it is much more normalized to respond to violence and injustice and discrimination with some combination of fatalist resignation and despair. I think that the very work of resisting injustice is itself a joyous thing and a thing that can help to cultivate joy in community is something that we would do well to keep sight of. And
Mhm.
it's one of the reasons that I personally keep returning to Robin Hood media. Very often I want to be reminded that not only can going into the Greenwood bring freedom, but sometimes you just want to metaphorically take a stag and beat up some guys with it. And that this is joyous work that sometimes, we need to go into whatever, metaphorically speaking, is the inaccessible Norman stronghold of our local community with a stag as a weapon. And I think that this is at the core of what makes the best of Robin Hood media inspiring and a place of comfort and joy for so many of us.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. That's wonderful. I could not have said it better myself,
Thank you.
and very much in alignment with my own philosophies. Uh, there's a good friend of the show, Mike Nichols, who runs this Robin Hood Discord, and he unfortunately has been having a very rough year. 2025 has been rough for him. It's been rough for a lot of us, and through it all, he has decided that his mantra is going to be merry anyway.
I love that. Oh, I love that. Please tell him from me that I love that.
Yes,
I
well,
kind of
he'll
I
hear it
kind of
here.
want that over my office door now. Be merry anyway. And
Yeah,
a little Robin Hood icon at the end.
I was like, I might have to put that on a coffee mug. That's perfect. Yeah.
Yes, yes, I love that. Right next to my billionaire tears coffee mug.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Well, before I let you go, is there anything that you would like to plug? I've mentioned before in our emails how much I appreciate the Footnoting History podcast.
Thank you. That is probably something I should mention, that I am here guesting, as it were, from Footnoting History, which is my usual home base in the podcasting world, where we believe that the best stories are always in the footnotes. And I and a number of grad school friends have been telling history footnotes, not exclusively medieval ones, there for over 10 years now.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I found it through just kind of this random happenstance. I was at a conference for science museums, which is what I do in my day job. And I was talking to a young lady who had questions about volunteer works with planetariums, and I was talking to her after a panel, and it kind of just came out that like she had sort of fallen into this job, but what she was actually studying was medieval studies. And I was like, oh, that's cool. I love medieval studies. I have this Robin Hood podcast. And she's like, shut up, I love Robin Hood. And I love podcasts. And let me tell you about my favorite, footnoting history. And
Oh,
yeah,
well, we are clearly honored to have among our listeners such a demonstrably cool person as a trained medievalist who wants to volunteer at a planetarium. That's so neat.
yes.
Yeah. I really like being able to talk about the history of science there as well, because it's something I teach a lot more than I get to study in depth, but that's a lot of fun to share stories about.
It
So no,
sure
I
is.
think that's it from my end. I don't I don't really think that there's academic work other than the open access stuff that we've already discussed that the Into the Greenwood podcast audience would be interested in. They can find the Robin Hood stuff if they want.
And it's wonderfully open access. I love that. I'll share some links to footnoting history, to some of the papers that we've discussed in the episode description, and I recommend people check them out. They're really fantastic little reads and eye-opening in some ways.
Thank you. Well, this has been a real pleasure.
It really has been. Thank you so much for joining me here in the Greenwood, and good luck at continuing to be merry.
And to you, all the best in this joyous and ongoing labor.
You're right. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
My thanks again to Lucy Barnhouse for joining me in the Greenwood. If you want to check out her article about disability and injustice in Robin Hood adaptations, I will include a link in the show description. I will also include links to some other papers and resources as well, including Azim and the Witch, Race, Disability, and Medievalisms in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves by Rachel Ellen Clark. I also highly suggest searching for Footnoting History wherever you get your podcasts. Lucy and all of the other historians there cover a wide range of fascinating topics. Even when they cover well-known figures or events, it's usually through the lens of lesser-known or often overlooked details. Perhaps my favorite episodes are the holiday roundups, where they all share obscure holiday traditions or events. And while you're out there subscribing to Footnoting History, feel free to bop over to the Into the Greenwood feed and leave that positive rating and review that you've been meaning to do but just keep forgetting about. Taking just a moment to do something as simple and quick as leaving that positive rating truly makes a difference. And as much as I don't love how much algorithms dictate our media consumption, without playing that game, it's extremely hard to gain new listeners, especially for small independent podcasts like this one. And if you really want to help out this little old podcast, please find us on buymeacoffee.com/intogreenwood, where it's extremely simple to donate one-time tips that show you appreciate all the time that goes into putting these episodes together. Even for simple interviews, you might be shocked to learn how much time is spent in audio editing. And of course, what really makes this possible at all is our supporters on patreon.com/intogreenwood. Those recurring donations, even at the $1 and $4 level, are what let us do the bare minimum to pay for our hosting fees, so these episodes can be out there for you to listen to. Plus, there's also some extremely fun bonus audio on the Patreon for everyone who is at the Merry Bandit or Notorious Outlaw levels. Of course, we'd be doing our guy Robin a disservice if we didn't donate a portion of all proceeds to a charitable cause. Our select charity remains Trees, Water, and People, a top-rated organization bringing sustainable food and clean water to impoverished communities around the world. If you've got a little extra cash and want to toss it at them directly, then by all means. As always, there is a link to their website in the episode description. Also in the episode description are links to our social media channels. Into the Greenwood can be found on Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook, all with the handle @IntoGreenwood. If you're inclined to give social media a pass entirely, then you can just reach out over email with the address intogreenwood@gmail.com. Additionally, there is an active Discord server for all things Robin Hood related, run by friend of the show, Mike Nichols. If you'd like to join that Discord community, where we source questions, organize watch parties, play games, have a book club, and just generally engage in friendly discussion, then reach out over email or social media to get an invitation. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing you all safe travels until our next journey together into the Greenwood.